Okay.
You're live.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Gareth. I'm going to be talking to you about the balancing act in the new normal. Balancing the burden of the clinical trial against that of the burden of the condition, how best to achieve patient recruitment, engagement, and retention as we move forward with COVID-19. First of all, the simple Facecraft. It's possibly the most iconic image of 2020 at the moment, which runs slightly counter to the innovation we're seeing at the moment as we're delivering clinical trials. For example, 30% of all active clinical trials are switched to a remote or virtual clinical trial in moving forward from May 2020. This is a huge acceleration of where we are with the pandemic acting as a major catalyst for change, which has caught some of our regulators slightly off guard as they're rushing to keep up with us. Prior to the pandemic, the concept behind remote, virtual and hybrid clinical trials, for example, has been a bit of a wish list, running and following that stream of the idea of patient centricity. Now, rather than being an aspiration, it's very much a necessity for delivery of clinical trials. And looking forward at the moment, we're seeing, say, remote monitoring, use of e-tools and home visits, all of which the design and delivery of these has been incredibly accelerated. But it would be unfair to say that innovation is simply coming out of crisis. It's not a new phenomenon. I just want to give you a very brief case study from the 1960s. In this case, this is a breast screening vehicle which was created to support a clinical trial when they were looking at the impact of breast screening. And at the time, their patient population was largely domestically based, residing at home, home keepers, I suppose you may say. However, with that cultural shift during the 60s, we're now seeing women in the workplace, which meant you could no longer rely on these women having free time effectively to attend clinics. Instead, the trial managers were having to actually attend their places of work. And thus these mobile units were created to reduce the burden on these participants, likewise make the trial more accessible. So this theme is something very much we're looking at with the concept of remote virtual clinical trials, trying to overcome some of those initial challenges for design and participation in clinical trials, effectively reducing that concept of the burden. So with remote monitoring, for example, alleviates the issue where we're trying to get onto clinical sites, for example, where we aren't able to have as many individuals apparent for supporting the monitoring for clinical visits, to reduce the burden the participants having to attend these centres, the use of e-tools to share information directly with participants and enable them to share information with their clinician, and also with the researcher from the comfort of their own home. And again, home visits is another way of alleviating those traditional burdens of site visits, time spent at the clinic, and even car parking fees. Subtle elements which have previously been detractors from the ability to participate in these trials. So all of these fall under the banner of patient centricity, finding solutions to the challenges experienced by patients. And there's been some challenge and some pushback previously where individuals say, well, how can we be sure that people are willing and able to use these remote digital tools, for example, with a lot of people that aren't particularly savvy? Well, again, this is something which we're seeing both as a result of the pandemic, but prior to this as well. To take the NHS in the UK in remote general practice primary care consultations, for example. In London, there was Babylon Health, who some of you may be aware of, was really streamlining this and pushing this forward. And it was a huge uptake in London where, again, we have a large working population who don't have the time or capacity to go to their GP during their core working hours, and therefore the remote or online consultation is very much to their advantage. Following the pandemic, however, this is the uptake of remote and virtual remote consultations to GPs has been hugely accelerated. We've become a nation of digitally savvy video conferences effectively. By necessity, for reaching out to friends and family, regardless of age, we've all had to use systems such as Zoom, Skype, WebEx, which have previously, certainly in Zoom's case, was quite a niche product for recording and sharing information. Now it's very much in one of our key vocabulary effectively, and it's a fairly standard tool. But we're also incorporating more subtle concepts and technologies in the way we're designing these tools to support patient involvement in clinical trials. The use of nudge theory and gamification, for example, when using these e-tools, can help increase adherence and engagement with those participants who are proceeding with these trials. By creating that sense of community and encouraging them to actively log on and share their data with research and clinicians, for example, 5 points, or have maybe a ranking system, you trigger that little endorphin rush effectively every time you see that. So these concepts, which we traditionally never really associated with clinical trials, are starting to merge together as we're looking outside our broader or narrower side clinical focus. Another example I wanted to give you, again, very much related to the pandemic, is vaccines. Traditionally, certainly in some children, it's quite a pleasant procedure. People often have a fear of needles. There's ways to get around this. The first one is quite a subtle one. You may be aware of Buzzy's needle pain relief. It's a very simple, straightforward medical device, just simply to reduce the pain in the area. It just cools the skin and gives a massaging effect. But looking forward as well, we're starting to see the uptake of augmented and virtual clinical trials to completely shift that dynamic of that participant's experience. Again, the idea of gamification coming into this to shift that perspective. But likewise, logistics, and I use an image here for Uber, Lyft in the US, for example, is the idea of patient concierge service. We can now support individuals by arranging travel on their behalf. So if we're covering their expenses, they don't need to do anything. To arrange their travel, they can see who their driver will be. It makes them far more comfortable in being able to transport to and from the clinic. With Amazon, certainly during the track and trace in the UK, they've been sending out the test kits. Hugely successful, massive infrastructure available to them. We're talking about shipping medication to homes, for example. We're normally looking at certain particular couriers, but I say this infrastructure does very much exist. Looking forward to organisations like delivery, again, focusing on that logistic element and the familiar brand. So the idea, again, that relationship with these brands is already there. They have the infrastructure, so I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing these being or increased uptake for the delivery of these remote and virtual hybrid clinical trials. And again, looking further still, we know that Amazon are exploring the use of drones in remote and rural elements of the US, for example, for transporting medication. There's no reason why they couldn't do this for clinical trials. And again, it's overcoming that barrier of geography and even the discrimination of geography when participants are looking to join clinical trials as well. But ultimately, changes don't have to be huge. As we can see from this MRI centre here, the only change really is just a lick of paint on the walls. But again, from the child's perspective, it's immediately changed that whole experience. So we can agree that ultimately what we're looking at is recruitment, patient retention, adherence to your protocol, but ultimately using the tools of engagement to be able to successfully deliver those trials. We're using a variety of different tools and strategies to enable each of these three to work. But the main challenge I'd say at the moment is that, are we designing these tools with patients? Are we designing them for patients? Using our assumptions and traditional ways of working to find a solution which may not necessarily be fit for purpose on reaching their demands. When designing clinical trials, we often put a number of expectations onto patient participants. We're asking them to fit the trial, not necessarily fitting the trial around them and their lifestyles. For example, a trial which I've been supporting recently, we had a number of colonoscopies to participate in this trial. Normally for a standard of care for someone living with colitis, for example, is an annual colonoscopy. It's obviously quite an invasive procedure. When you're introducing up to 3 in a year, it's immediately incredibly off-putting. To some individuals, it's a completely barrier for participation, and it's not just the procedure. There are additional elements to this which we hadn't considered but were equally off-putting, such as the laxative and having to manage that at work. But likewise, we could also be looking at the size of the blister packs, for example, for tablets. Will it fit in someone's handbag? How often are they having to come onto site? We've also had the idea of the home visits as well. During the pandemic, those who are immunosuppressed or taking immunosuppressants would simply say to us that I'm shielding, I don't want anyone to come to my house, regardless if I know who they are or not, it doesn't matter, it's simply breaching that sense of trust. So we need to introduce flexibility as well. Although we're seeing the uptake and use of remote clinical trials, it's not necessarily suitable for everyone. As mentioned previously about the individual who was unhappy to have home visits for their condition, which is going to be part of that trial design, you need to be able to offer them a suitable alternative where possible. And prior to the pandemic as well, I've spoken to individuals who were saying that for them, home visits just simply wouldn't work. They wanted to completely disassociate the concept of the clinical trial from their own home back into that of the clinic, very much towards that traditional clinical trial, which we're moving away from. And part of the reason for that was they had young children and it was quite an invasive procedure, and they wanted to keep that separated and have the idea of a full sanctuary effect. And sometimes it can be more esoteric decisions as well. For example, one individual was saying that because the medication they're on made them very difficult to effectively to maintain the lifestyle they were used to. They described themselves being someone who'd had a cleaner to come to the house, but they tidy up before then. With that medication, they weren't able to fully do that, so they felt the house was in a bit of a state, and they didn't want a nurse or whoever it may be coming into a home visit to administer that medication and seeing what they perceived to be the house in a state. And for them, that was simply a no-go. So it can be incredibly subtle, or just areas we aren't able to predict. So that element of flexibility is incredibly key. This also brings on to the concept of patient-reported outcomes and engagement as well. So clinical trials have traditionally been designed in a lab by scientists and clinicians who have an extremely good understanding of that condition. However, what they're writing for is to very much pre-considered time points. It may be extending a length of life or reducing mortality, for example, but that may not be aligned with the patient's perspective and what they see as to be a quality of life. They may not be interested in doing an extra 5 years, for example, when they just, from them, a trial which said they wouldn't ache when they get up in the morning would be far more attractive. So to give you an example is inhalable insulin. This was created at great expense and designed as a medical device to alleviate the issue for diabetic patients to have to self-inject with insulin. Unfortunately for the participants, this didn't meet a number of their quality of life concerns. They were concerned by inhaling insulin and not being able to have a full control over how to manage this. The device itself was rather large. Again, it didn't fit in a handbag or a pocket, and therefore it wasn't convenient when they were traveling or out and about. And also at the same time, the needles being used for the self-injection had also been overhauled effectively, or much easier to use effectively. So the concept of this inhalable insulin just didn't fly. And I think the design for this was several billion, if not just less than several million. It was certainly a huge amount of money, which was simply not designed with patients and therefore didn't meet with their requirements. So we recognise that involving patients right at the beginning of the clinical development process at the protocol development stage has potential to significantly improve the study delivery, improvement design, recruitment, retention, adherence, and the participants' experience of the trial overall. Patients are ultimately the experts of their own condition. So why are we struggling to involve patients in these discussions? Well, unfortunately, there's a number of challenges which we can sometimes struggle to overcome. First of all, it's a varied understanding and knowledge about commercial clinical trials. The truth of the matter is, unfortunately, but sometimes life sciences seem to be a bit of a corporate enterprise and aren't fully trusted. The regulatory pathways for engaging and involving with patients in clinical trial design itself can sometimes be quite labyrinthian, very difficult to navigate and overcome. There's a huge disparity in patient payments and how we do this, and creating unconscious bias, or simply just not providing full value effectively. A colleague of mine has described this as a Wild West scenario, with huge variety in the values being contributed to patients for their time and their efforts. Likewise, we're seeing extremely heavy-handed legal CDAs written for lawyers first and patients second. One of our patient research ambassadors described these as a bit of a paper tiger. Ultimately, he recognised that if he was to share some information from the cafe or breach that CDA, for example, he was very aware that the company simply wasn't going to sue him, because if they did, he said, you can take my telly, I'm going straight to the press, and that will bring down the whole industry. So putting these huge lengthy documents is simply not fit for purpose. It's extremely imposing on participants, and the threat of being sued for turning up and having a conversation in the first place really doesn't fly. And of course, we have to mention the handling of patient identifiable data and dreaded GDPR. So I'm just going to drill down on a couple of these very briefly. The first of which is that concept of trust. And unfortunately, the life sciences is quite poorly seen. Certainly, it's below academic-led research, where we're seeing quite reasonable engagement with, but the highest, this again is quite UK focused, but the NHS is very much adopted very high engagement with clinical research. A US poll led in 2018 showed that the life sciences industry was trailing behind car manufacturers, for example, and even then the US administration under Donald Trump. So it had quite a poor relationship. Again, with the pandemic, we are seeing that to shift slightly with regards to views of the vaccine research, therapeutic research, some of the humanitarian work which is ongoing, sharing medication. It seemed, again, they're distancing a little bit from the slightly aggressive government movements towards the uptake of vaccines in the US prior to the election. But we are now countering the anti-vax movement as well, and various conspiracy theories and misinformation. So although it is getting more higher and more robust relationship, I'd say there is still issues we need to overcome. Another element is the use of language. We're often using very hierarchical language. We use terms such as suffering with rather than living with. The patient itself immediately sets someone on a pedestal, whereas participant is a much more balanced word. So we tend to favour pity over empathy, which again creates that hierarchical relationship rather than treating these individuals in the partnership way of working. There's also concern internally, or there can be concerns internally for companies about letting their staff speak to patients in the first place. Do they feel they're sufficiently trained or have the skills to be able to speak to people? Again, when working with the NCRI, or National Cancer Research Institute, and their consumer forum, there was one company who were engaging with this group to share their learnings about their cancer oncology portfolio and how they can improve that, make that more engaging with patients. They brought a number of protocol authors individuals to speak to these participants, but likewise, they had a horde of lawyers who were forced to stand against the wall to monitor the conversations. Again, that created a very negative dynamic in that conversation. And when we're talking about all the multiple devices we're using, it's important to also consider not just patient centricity, but also site centricity. You have to work with sites to manage multiple vendors, whether that be patient couriers, data services, multiple logins, would potentially risk shifting a burden away from the sponsor or the CRO onto the site, or even onto the patient. Again, looking at plug and play versus bespoke tools for patients. If they can use their own device, keep it nice and simple rather than giving them 4 or 5 different devices they need to do different things on. But there's other elements we also need to consider, such as font size, for example, and the reading age of these individuals in question. Is the language appropriate? Can they read it? Can they customize it so they can actually use these tools? Leo Pharma have a fantastic remote device they've used for a skin trial, where it captures the image of the rash or the skin lesions effectively, and it shows over time how that medication is having an impact. And that's useful because obviously the clinicians and the researchers can see the effect of that. They can capture all the information they need. but they're not excluding the patients from being able to see that information as well. And that's where that engagement comes in. So participants are very able to gain their own understanding of how that data is being used. They feel that they are sharing their information, and they equally have access to that, which is incredibly important. And they feel more involved with that trial, and therefore more compelled to adhere to continue to that clinical trial. So the prospects of engaging with patients can sometimes be incredibly daunting. But thankfully, the NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, is very much here to help you. I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of the Clinical Research Network, who I represent. So we support clinical research across all therapeutic areas, which we roughly group into 30 specialty areas. We work across the UK with 15 local clinical research networks within England. And again, working very closely with what we call devolved nations in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. We provide a full suite of feasibility services, all free to companies, from our early contact and engagement, helping you to co-design your clinical trials, right through to performance monitoring. Ultimately, a full life cycle of a clinical trial. And when we're talking about involving and engaging patients, we have the Patient Engagement and Clinical Development Service, a standardized industry-wide approach to engaging patients earlier in the clinical development process, instilling a culture of partnership working between the life science industry, patient organizations, charities, and patients themselves. And again, further information can be found on the website listed here. And likewise, as part of the industrial strategy of the life sciences sector deal 2, we're proud to announce the patient recruitment centres, which will shortly be coming, we're launching tomorrow, in fact. And these are 5 high throughput centres, clinical centres of excellence in the UK. And the reason I want to announce these is these are designed to work in a franchise model, work as a test bed for new and exciting innovations such as remote clinical trials and virtual clinical trials, for example, using multiple modality models, using new and innovative techniques to outreach, recruitment, and adherence to these trials. The Newcastle Hospital, for example, they have launched one of the first UK virtual clinical trials. Originally, this was a traditional clinical trial in IBD. However, following the pandemic, it transitioned to a virtual clinical trial. And what's really exciting about this project is that they've been to capture feedback from participants both at the beginning, during the traditional side, and also in that transition to the virtual side. So they get a first-hand account of what's working and likewise what isn't working for those trials. And the uptake for the virtual over the site visits element of the trial has been extremely positive. I think about 80 to 90% are focusing on that virtual option as opposed to the standard option. We also have the NHS Vaccine Registry in partnership with NHS Digital and NIHR. And the reason I wanted to mention this again is doing direct outreach to patients, partnering directly to clinical trials, giving the opportunity to participate by matching into studies. And this is certainly something we're looking at delivering in the future for all therapeutic areas. It's a big step towards a national innovation of being able to support patient recruitment into clinical trials. And this is being facilitated by the NIHR's Be Part of Research. So we're seeing a lot of technological innovation in clinical trials. We're adopting new ways of working. Some of this has been as a result of the catalyst of the pandemic. Others have been a long time coming, and we're looking further afield on what's working in other industries and how we can properly incorporate these. As we know, it's very difficult to plan for 10, even 5 years. We didn't expect the pandemic to have such an impact so rapidly. But I think what we can say is that co-creation ultimately is going to be the way we move forward together. So I'll leave it there because I'm conscious of time. But if you do have any questions, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit, and you can either answer those offline, provide my contact details there, or you can use the chat functionality here as well. Thank you very much.